I'm John Wright, faculty member for the last 35 years in the departments of African American, African Studies, and English.
And I'm Rob Hahn. I'll be asking the questions. Today is December 17th, 2018, and we are on the campus, the West Bank of the University of Minnesota. Let me start about as basically as it comes. Tell me your first memory of Dinkytown.
I came to the university as a freshman in the fall of 1963. I'd had no experience of Dinkytown before that, and it was an entirely new kind of space, a place for me, clearly associated with the campus. And it was a really exciting, commercial district with a lot of the arts-oriented music, books, and street life that I found new and exciting. So for me, it was a place where I had lunch regularly, where I went to meet friends, to socialize, and also to party. Later on, again, I would live in the Dinkytown area as a student in apartments and so on in the Dinkytown district.
What was it, in your opinion, at that time? I think you arrived 63 or so as a freshman,
Yeah.
right? Yeah. What was it about that time, some would call it the heyday of Dinkytown, that gave it so much character, made it so alive?
Well, in those years, of course, it was in the midst of the 1960s and all the upsurge in terms of youth rebellion, student protest, the energies again from the counterculture, and also from civil rights and the rise of the Black Power movement, the Black Arts movement, and the mix of all these things came through student life and campus life and flowed into Dinkytown, where oftentimes things that weren't being dealt with in classes, in the classrooms and so forth, got a chance to mix and ferment in a freer, more open atmosphere.
You had a one-sentence statement when we last spoke, or when we met previously, and I want you to elaborate on it as it pertains to Dinkytown and maybe the campus on the whole. Excuse me. You said the paradigm of social protest changed. How so?
The Vietnam War had a significant part to do with that, and the convergence of the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement, and in particular, again, in the mid-60s with the transition from civil rights to Black Power, brought a whole new dynamic, increasingly radical dynamic to the politics on the campus, and again to the politics of the counterculture during those years.
You alluded to it, and you said there was that bohemian dimension to that.
Yeah, some folks always thought about Dinkytown as a kind of a Midwestern Greenwich Village. Of course, in scale, we didn't compare with Greenwich Village at all. But the mix again of a kind of a New York bohemian style counterculture lifestyle, coffee houses and shops, and late night music and parties, and of course the growing rebellion against older generation sexual mores, and the mix again of drugs, alcohol, and illicit drugs as well became part of that heady process of confronting the larger society, and also trying to chart some new ways to the future.
How did you dress back in the day?
Well, I guess at the height of those years, I was wearing bell bottoms, wildly colored bell bottoms, and flowery shirts, and leather Big Apple hats, and so on. And again, at the time, I had a large afro and a large, long sideburns on the side. So I guess I fit well into that kind of mix. And it was a kind of a convergence again of the emerging counterculture at the time, and African American cultural nationalism and the Black arts, and the influx of influences again from African American cultural corridors, from the classic soul music of the era to funk and free jazz that became part of the milieu that spread into cuisine and to costuming and all the rest.
How did the different backgrounds, be it race related or cultural related, get together and interact with each other in Dinkytown?
Well, there were a lot of, whether you're in the coffee house context or on street corners, because again, one of the features of the time was a lot of street corner activity, which sometimes we involved artists sitting on the street corners, on the sidewalks, hawking their works, but talking and conversing with passersby and potential buyers for their enterprises. And all that contributed to I think a pretty free and open discussion, again from a variety of different cultural and national backgrounds, and all that was, I think, really exciting.
You used a term when we talked previously, wigger. How would you define that?
Well, wigger, of course, is short for white nigger, to use the pejorative. But the term, that concept, I mean, Norman Mailer's essay, "The White Negro," which was basically a significant part again of that, that then new wave rebellion against traditional larger mores, coined this idea of the hipster as a model again for cultural rebellion in the white world, but at the same time a point of connection that in part indicated the extent to which African American lifestyles and attitudes and music and ways of talking and walking and dancing and moving were affecting the larger society. So wigger is one of a long series of terms that have basically addressed this kind of symbiotic relationship between African Americans and the larger society, a relationship that goes back into the 19th century. So in the 19th century, bohemians, countercultural types like Walt Whitman, were saying back in the 1850s that the new American opera would most likely be found on the lips and in the music of slaves. So again, that whole history, again, about these alternative ways of thinking about culture, and particularly about bourgeois culture, and African Americans as a countercultural point of reference, is a long history.
Do you remember the protest on the ROTC building, either the day of or the day after the Kent State killings?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. I, in fact, I had a short stint in Air Force ROTC in that old armory building, but I didn't last more than a semester in Air Force ROTC. Their ways and mine, there were too many points of conflict. So I was very familiar with that, because I mean the armory and these other local military recruiting offices, and there were several of them on campus during those days, became staging points for protests.
Let's talk about some of the characters and some of the locations in Dinkytown to get your thoughts and memories on them. Starting with Walking Phil Holland.
Phil Holland, again, became a Dinkytown legend during the years that he was on the scene. He lived in the area, moved around in a variety of rooming houses and so forth. His origins always remained a bit of a mystery. There are a lot of legends and stories about Phil Holland, but he was a very stately, dignified, tall, lean brother who had come from the Deep South, and most of the stories I had heard, or that I can recall Phil talking about, were from Atlanta, somewhere near Atlanta, one of the big southern cities, and had somehow ended up in Minnesota and in the campus area. There were stories that he had gone to St. John's up in Collegeville or one or another school here locally. He rarely ever wanted to give much detail about his personal background, but he could give you tremendous detail about almost anything else. He was a tremendous conversationalist and could talk in a very knowledgeable way about a wide array of subjects, from business and economics to politics to culture and art to sexuality and so on. So yeah, Phil was one of the very memorable figures who was around Dinkytown for years.
And fairly dapper. The way
Very dapper, yeah. Most often in his heyday, he was usually in a suit, sometimes a blazer, so forth. With the passage of time, that changed, and he wasn't quite as debonair later on as he was in the earlier years, in his heyday.
Some people I've talked to suggest that maybe he was a little off from a neuro standpoint.
Yeah. I don't think from a clinical standpoint that you would pin Phil down as being in any way psychologically dangerous or dysfunctional. But there was a point at which his relationship to reality became fuzzy. and that would come out periodically in the way he talked. But he could carry on very coherent, extended conversations about complex subjects with great ease. But yes, there was something about Phil that I think made it difficult for Phil to fit in the larger society. And because the atmosphere in Dinkytown and around the campus was a more free-floating kind of world, in that kind of context, he could operate, I think, without any major obstacles.
Another character that you told me about, and I hope you'll elaborate here, Anthony A. Nelson.
Anthony A. Nelson, Tony Nelson. Tony Nelson was another one of the figures who kind of moved back and forth between the campus arena and the Minneapolis North Side and South Side and St. Paul. He was a poet, a freelance poet, and a large, dark-skinned, broad-smiled brother who had one leg, but who didn't allow his one-leggedness to constrict in any way either his poetry or his relationships with people in the Dinkytown and the campus area. He published his poems. Most of them were what you'd call broadsides, occasional poems or poems dedicated to particular individuals or to self-exploration. And he published them in typescript pamphlets, basically, that were produced by his own publishing company. Somewhere had an address down on Lake Street for some of these collections. One of them I can recall was called Ballads for Small-Time Losers. Was one of those, and he would characteristically in the opening pages of the pamphlets give a long lists of all the people who had either bought a copy of the poems or were his friends or associates or supporters, and many of them kind of reflected the poetry that was a part of fusion of the older generation of beat poets' work, and he was quite familiar with the Ginsbergs and Ferlinghettis and so on at the time. But also it reflected what was called the new black poetry that was emerging then in the context of the black arts movement. So in that sense, Tony was part of a local manifestation of the black arts and their meetings here with the counterculture and the bohemian side of campus life.
I think you told me that he was, maybe it was a mutual relationship. The young ladies liked him quite a bit.
He was, yes, he had a particular verve in dealing with male-female relationships and sexuality and sensuality. And I think his way of addressing male-female relationships had struck a particular chord with many of the young women on campus, again, who became some of his ardent supporters and purchasers and distributors of his collections of poetry.
Another well-known individual in Dinkytown in the day was Melvin McCosh from McCosh Books.
McCosh, and McCosh, of course, there were several bookstores, the older bookstores there. McCosh, I think, became the best known of the old line bookstore owners. And his bookstore became a real hangout. And McCosh himself was enormously learned and erudite in terms of the book world. And if you came in and asked him about any particular topic, he could immediately not just lead you to books that he had on hand, but point you towards titles he didn't own that you should think about. So yes, Melvin was I think a really pivotal character in the Dinkytown scene in those years.
Were you aware of or even involved in the little sit-in at Bridgeman's that was done on his behalf when they wanted to expand Bridgeman's and get rid of McCosh Books?
Yeah, I was very much aware of it. I wasn't directly involved in the Bridgeman's protest, but that, like 2 or 3 other protests that took place in Dinkytown those years that involved basically corporate enterprises trying to displace some of the traditional small shop owners, whether they were bookstore owners or restaurants or coffee house owners, became causes célèbres for the Dinkytown aficionados and campus students and so forth. So yes, so Melvin McCosh and the protest against Bridgeman's were in part an attempt again to try to keep Dinkytown from going over into the hands of the corporate merchandisers.
And one of the more famous ones, if not most famous, was the protest over the Red Barn.
Yes, yeah, absolutely.
Let's talk about the bookstores. We talked a little bit about the bookstores. The coffee shops. I think you said it was in the coffee shops, or maybe in a different location, where you honed your skill playing pool.
Well, there weren't any full-size pocket billiard or billiard tables in Dinkytown then, but several of the restaurants and bars had small bar tables, 6-foot or 8-foot tables, where students played and gambled on the pool table. I was part of that enterprise, but I did most of my pool playing in Kaufman Union, in the old pool room at the east end of Kaufman in those years, where you had full-size tables, both pocket billiards and billiards tables and snooker tables. And the group that played there often spilled over into the Dinkytown clubs and bars, and that became an alternate arena again for playing pool. But I spent a lot of evenings into the late night playing pool on the bar tables in Dinkytown.
What are your memories of Al's breakfast?
Well, that Al's breakfast had marvelous breakfast food, but you couldn't get into Al's because there were almost always a line, unless you went at some very strange hour to try to get in there. And once you did get in, you could hardly turn around. Al and the waiters and waitresses behind the bar, were in motion, in frantic motion almost all the time. But it was a marvelous place if you could get into Al's. And of course, it had been an institution there for so long that it was hard to go to Dinkytown and at least try to get a peek into Al's breakfast. I most often would get into Al's very early in the morning after a night out, one way or the other, and get there before the regular morning crowd got in.
What about Mama D's? Did you spend much time eating there?
Yes, a lot of time in Mama D's and Vecchio's, which they made great pizza, had really flavorful, spicy food, and the Italian fare. I guess part of my inclinations towards Italian food, and perhaps even more than the pizza. I love the Italian sausage and peppers dishes, entrees that they had on the menus there at Mama D's and at Vecchio's.
You told me some of your thoughts and memories of the street corner musicians. What did people just like throw out their instrument or open their case and start playing?
Well, I think some of the street corner musicians were in fact students who were enrolled in the School of Music here and were trying to make a few bucks or to hone their craft by sitting on the street corners in Dinkytown and playing violins or guitars or wind instruments or whatever, and drawing crowds and attracting a few dollars in process. But I think many of them were university music students, but some of them were itinerant musicians from around town who saw the Dinkytown scene as one place where they could come and perhaps pick up a few bucks in the course of a day.
You may have said this, and maybe I didn't hear it. Did Anthony A. Nelson recite poetry on the street corner?
Rarely.
Okay.
Rarely.
Rolling again.
Okay, let me just go over some notes here, because we've covered
How
most
about
of
the
it.
scholar?
Yeah, the scholar. Memories of the scholar.
Yeah. Well, like the Scholar was, of course, it was famous, of course, in part because of Dylan's time there as a musician. But it was a great coffee house atmosphere. Of course, it was dingy in many ways, and it made no effort to try to make it look chic or modern. But that was part of the coffee house ethos of those years. I didn't go to the Scholar much for the coffee. I wasn't a coffee drinker, but again, the food, the sandwiches, and the music. Those were the primary draws, for the Scholar. And the crowd, again, it was the same kind of campus bohemian crowd that was part of Dinkytown's appeal to young folks who were basically, exploring the possibilities of life and politics and love and all the rest.
What sort of music did you like back in the day?
I'm a product of the generation of classic soul. So again, the early '60s music. I mean, the Motown scene was central for me. So they were in the world of the Miracles and the Impressions and Smokey Robinson and Marvin Gaye and all the rest. Plus, again, the emergence of funk and free jazz. So the music of James Brown and Aretha Franklin, Nina Simone, so forth, but also some of the experimental free jazz groups. And there were a number of free jazz musicians and ensembles who worked the music scene here in the Twin Cities. Some of them were imports from Chicago, as was the case with the blues. Again, I was a heavy blues aficionado, and then there were a number of blues clubs in the area over here. Probably the best known, again, to emerge on those years was probably the Caboose, but Archie Bunkers, later on Walewski's and so forth. They weren't in Dinkytown proper, but the spillover from all of that, and again the influx again of Chicago blues and jazz musicians here who played it oftentimes at places like the Scholar, and so on, were part of the Dinkytown orbit.
When you compare Dinkytown today to the time you spent there in the 60s and early 70s, how would you describe change and what has been lost?
Most of the places in Dinkytown now are part of chain operations, at least many of them certainly are. There are some still small boutiques and so forth. The biggest losses are the bookstores themselves. I think the Kristen's Bookhouse is, I think, the last survivor of the old bookhouse scene in Dinkytown. And we do have bars that have some coffee house dimension to them, and there is some live music there. But the mix again of those forms and of the visual arts, the painters and so forth, the mix of painters and poets and musicians and street folk who were part of the old Dinkytown scene, that combination simply doesn't exist in today's Dinkytown.
What impact did living in and interacting in Dinkytown, as you look back, have on your life as you know it today?
I think for me, because I, like many of my peers, was wrestling with, like I say, social values, political values, and so on. And there was a mix of competing ideas and values and lifestyles that were on display in Dinkytown that at least gave me a broader sense of possibilities in terms of the kind of choices that I made. I was also moving back and forth between Dinkytown and the African-American communities in the Twin Cities here on the north side in Plymouth, the old Plymouth Avenue of those years of the 1960s, in the Rondo district in St. Paul, with its shops and community centers and so forth, and in South Minneapolis. So Dinkytown was part of a cluster of discrete communities that I circulated through, and Dinkytown had its own kind of distinctive flavor there. I mean, part of the mix was, in some ways, it was more international because, again, in this mix of artists and eccentrics, again, there were significant numbers of students and people from abroad. Again, one of the artists I remember from those years, again, was a Zimbabwean, Rhodesian artist named Rex Meripiri, who was one of the painters who regularly was on the scene in Dinkytown and who, to some extent, again, sold his work or exhibited his work either on the streets or in shops there. Robert Biddle was another African-American artist, again, who you saw in that terrain, and who also moved in the gallery world here locally, but also in African-American communities and so forth. So it was this kind of this cross current of cultural communities that Dinkytown was part of that had, I think, a big impact on me.
A couple final things. I'm going to run a couple names past you. Tell me if you have any memories of them or even knew them. Bill Tilton.
I knew Bill Tilton quite well. Bill Tilton was part of the SDS orbit on campus. Art Himmelman, I think if I recall, was president of SDS when the Afro-American Action Committee, of which I was an executive committee member, when, after the King assassination in spring of '68, when we presented a list of 7 demands that I actually drafted in the days following the King assassination, we presented then to Malcolm Moos. In the following January of 1969, when the university's intransigence led us to take over the administration building, let us take over Morrill Hall, Bill Tilton and SDS were important allies for us and tried to form a ring around the building to minimize the potential conflict between some of the right-wing anti-takeover protesters who wanted to basically create visible conflict.
We interviewed Bill last week, and he, like you, has a real strong persona.
Yeah.
How would you describe him back in the day?
Well, Bill was fiery, but he wasn't, I think, a natural orator in that respect. He was obviously highly intelligent and so forth, but there's a side of Bill that's very thoughtful and particular about what he says and does, so on. So he was very effective, I think, as a communicator. And in that regard, again, his commitments, his thinking and ideas, I think, were very, very critical in terms of the interchange that we had with SDS during those years.
What am I forgetting to ask about that you want to add with regard to Dinkytown?
Well, I think I have mentioned again the circle of parties that were also part of the social atmosphere surrounding Dinkytown. And because many of us who lived in Dinkytown, again, for a while, I lived at 7th and 7th Street Southeast in an old, 3-story ramshackle duplex. But many of us got involved in parties that bridged some of these different cultural communities. And one of the links clearly was with the world of the fraternities and sororities and the parties life that they had. And that was, I think, a significant milieu also. And sometimes, you would go to Dinkytown, again, to places like Vecchio's and Mama D's and so on, and the Scholar, etc., to make connections to parties, to find out what was going on and where, and whether it was in fraternity or sorority houses or in this apartment or that, or whether it was linked up to the campus varsity athletes groups and so on. So in that sense, it became a kind of staging ground also for some of the late night social activities.
Oh, you got any questions you want to ask?
I do. What about the development of, since you lived on 7th and 7th, the development of 35W and how it split Dinkytown in so many ways?
Oh boy. I'm trying to remember when 35W came through those years. I mean, it did because, of course, it cut. You were north of 10th Street, and the bridge that ran through there, and 35W did indeed cut off part of old Dinkytown from that part that we now associate basically with the Hennepin Avenue side, which now some folks refer to as NoHo or whatever else, but the Central Avenue and Hennepin corridor. But also, I mean, in those days too, of course, the West Bank campus community didn't exist in the early 60s, mid-60s. The West Bank of the campus didn't emerge till later on. But this whole Cedar Riverside area was a kind of independent region also, but it had strong links to Dinkytown. And oftentimes, again, you would circulate outside of Dinkytown to the Cedar Riverside bars and restaurants and so forth. So there are places at Seven Corners, for instance, like Sergeant Preston's, and the other institutions, most of which are now gone there, again, became part of basically the same kind of campus orbit. So Dinkytown and Seven Corners and Stadium Village were a kind of a triangular set of campus-related communities that you move through. And they were in many places in our minds and so forth, closely integrated because you could hop from one to the other, and they all had their own distinctive differences. In fact, you know, on the West Bank, we talked earlier about the bohemian aspects of Dinkytown. Well, the old West Bank area was called Bohemian Flats. Again, before before the bridge, the Washington Avenue Bridge was completed and the West Bank campus was built. So, you know, this whole business about the bohemian side of things made Dinkytown part of this kind of triangulation of the three, again, Dinkytown, Stadium Village, and the Cedar Riverside area.
The other question I had is, when you think of Dinkytown today, what are your feelings? How you characterize how you feel about it today?
Well, I still go to Dinkytown, and the places I'm most likely to go or be seen these days are the Annie's Parlor, which still serves, in my mind, the best hamburgers in Dinkytown, and is kind of a rustic and kind of a survivor of those that old scene. Annie's Parlor on the one hand, and you know, what used to be Gray's Drug, there on the corner of 4th and 14th. And boy, I'm blocking here now.
Varsity Theater, if you ever go to any?
Oh yes, used to go to the Varsity Theater. Also, although I haven't gone to Varsity Theater for many years. Of course, the Varsity Theater in Dinkytown and the Oak Street Cinema in Stadium Village were primary movie houses, small movie houses, again, in those areas where we went off times. And you know, I can remember sitting in, I think it was the Varsity rather than the Oak Street Cinema, where I saw back in 1967 or 68 the film version of Leroy Jones's Dutchman, which was a transfixing cinema experience for me, and where the world of black bohemianism, all right, and the world of the wiggers, you know, came together in a highly dramatic and violent way. But again, oft times, again, part of it, you know, the scenes for the Varsity Theater and the Oak Street Cinema was where avant-garde international films were shown. I perhaps didn't allude to that earlier on, but again, those were places where, again, the kinds of films and crowds that you didn't see elsewhere in the metro area congregated. And again, you had a really heady mix, again, of ideas, artistic attitudes, again, the infusion of continental European attitudes and culture and art and film, so forth. At least has some kind of local manifestation.